and the UU for hosting again, and 350 Vermont for co-sponsoring with us, and all of you for coming out today. So, here to tell you all a little bit about the UN climate negotiations and what happened there in the first couple weeks of December, about the organization that I was involved with, the youth organization that brought me there and that I worked with. And then we'll go into a little bit about the outcome of the Paris Agreement and what that means for the international community, but also what it means locally for us here at home. And then I want to open it up for a discussion with all of us. And then Kathy will take it over to talk about this new initiative that Rights and Democracy and 350 Vermont and a bunch of other organizations have come together to work on to build out jobs, justice, and climate work in Vermont. So, without further ado, go into a little bit about the UN climate negotiations. This was the 21st convening of the parties, conference of the parties. You may have heard COP21. So this is the 21st conference, and it was held in Paris this year. And the COPs, all these negotiators come together from countries around the world for the last 21 years, have been trying to come up with an international agreement to reduce carbon emissions, and have largely failed again and again. The Kyoto Protocol came out of this framework, and because of the United States not ratifying it, it didn't lead to the emission reductions that we needed to see then. So this 21st Conference Parties has been kind of heralded as this great success by a lot of groups, because for the first time there is an international agreement to reduce carbon emissions that the United States supports, and so we can go more into that, and I'm sure folks in this room have a lot of thoughts about that too. That's just a background on the conferences and what the goals have been for the last 21 years. This conference of the parties was different than the previous for a few different reasons, but one of the things that shifted in the past couple of years post-Kyoto Protocol was the United Nations kind of realized that the way that they had been going about trying to create these international agreements hadn't been working because of ugly political realities in the United States and fossil fuel corporation influence. It wasn't working to try to create this top-down command and control style agreement that Kyoto had attempted to create. And so for the past few COPs, they've changed their structure and had tried to create more of a bottom-up country, starting at the national level with countries, rather than coming from the UN saying we need to do a certain thing, rather coming from the countries individually saying here's what we can do, and then creating an agreement out of that by compiling all of those they're called nationally determined contributions. So that's like the United States, for example, saying here's what we can do in terms of emissions reductions, by what date. The Clean Power Plan is part of that, and all the countries that came to COP brought their own nationally determined contributions to that agreement. So it's a really different structure than the Kyoto Protocol, which is one of the reasons why it's being heralded as a success, because it was possible for it to be signed, because the ambition was only going to ever be as great as each individual country brought themselves. So I felt like it was important to go to this, and I think a lot of the people in the organization that I'm a part of felt like it was important to go to this, not so much because we felt like we could have an impact on the agreement itself, but rather because it was an opportunity to meet young people and activists from around the world who are really committed to this stuff and have been for a long time, and it's a huge privilege to be able to go. So you certainly only get a cross-section of people at the COPs, but because there was so much hype around this particular climate negotiations, there were a lot of people in town. And so it felt like a real movement moment where we could come together and meet a lot of people and create the connections that we're going to need to grow and build moving forward if we want to create the world we want to see. So that was my motivation for going. I went last year as well to COP20 in Lima with the same organization, and it didn't have the same energy by any means in terms of, it was more of a preparation for this year. But this year it felt like a lot of organizations had tried to come together to do something really big. And I can talk a little bit about just some of the impediments to that and some of the ways that we got around it, because as I'm sure you know, there was a major attack in Paris on the 13th of November, and then COP was supposed to start the 30th. And so France went into major security state mode, and all large gatherings were banned. And so this march that had been planned by every major NGO in the world, like green NGO, was canceled. Over 1 million people were expected for that, and it would have blown the People's Climate March out of the water. Because of the security state, it was canceled. I think there are some questions for me about whether in Paris the government went too far in terms of, was that necessary to lock down the entire city? They let up their lockdown 2 days before the agreement was signed, so it was just interesting timing. It felt, at least for me, it felt a little bit opportunistic in terms of suppressing the activism that had been planned for that time. But people were incredibly creative, and it was fun to see what, in such short time periods, people were able to come up with to show popular support for climate action on a really quick timeline. So large gatherings were banned, so instead of holding a march the day before the climate talks were set to begin, we held a human chain. So it was single file on the sidewalk, which the police didn't give us too much trouble about, and it was over 1 kilometer long of people holding hands. And my slideshow has gone away, so I'm going to pop this back up. But there's some photos on here of the human chain, and then another. They'll come up in a minute, but there's some slideshow photos of the human chain, and then also of they filled an entire plaza with shoes that were supposed to represent the people who would have marched, and the Pope sent in a pair of shoes, and Marianne Cotillard, famous actresses, sent in. So it was kind of fun to see what came out of the creativity that came out of that those tough restrictions from the government. The photos that you're seeing right now are primarily of young people involved with the Sustain Us delegation that I took part in. So Sustain Us is a youth-run organization. All of the daily operations are run by people under, or 26 and under. And we have a board of directors who are older, but the daily operations of the organization are all young people, and the organization sends delegations to a number of UN conferences, including, has primarily done invested energy into the climate talks, but also conferences on biodiversity and gender and women. So the photos that you're seeing are mostly delegates from Sustain Us.
What is the name of your organization?
It's called Sustain Us, and it's kind of a play on word with sustain and then U.S. It's U.S. youth. So our delegation was all United States youth from around the country.
And Aly, do you want to explain the hand gestures?
Yeah, sure. That was my next piece, is going into our work a little bit. So I want to explain the structure of our delegation, because I think that we did a really good job. In some ways, I think that we did a good job of creating a structure for ourselves that worked, and so I want to talk about that. But first, just because everyone's curious about the work, some of the things that we did, we worked on a campaign, the Ending Fossil Fuel Subsidies campaign that's run by Oil Change International. We worked with youth from around the world on a campaign called Zero by 2050, so that's zero fossil fuel emissions by 2050. And that's the zero, like the circle that you're seeing on people's eyes, is like zero by 2050. And then the first day of COP, it was called Leaders Day. Almost every day of COP has a theme. So the first day was Leaders Day, and Obama came in and Hollande and all these people, and they completely drowned out the fact that the largest coalition of member states at the Conference of Parties came together, the Climate Vulnerable Forum, to call for a change in the goal of maximum global temperature rise. So out of Copenhagen in 2009, the COP came out with maximum of 2 degrees global temperature rise. And this year, Climate Vulnerable Forum, this coalition of member states, came together to say that will actually put many of us underwater, that will completely cut off our food supply. 2 degrees is unacceptable. And so that first day they came out with, they called it the Manila Paris Declaration. And it was a call for 1.5 degrees Celsius maximum global temperature rise. So we ended up kind of creating the youth from around the world. Like, that's something that we should really get behind, is they got drowned out in the media by the leaders in town. So we held a rally 2 days later with youth from around the world to raise awareness about that call. And so that's the one point, I'm not even going to do it right, but 1.5. It's the call for that maximum temperature rise, written into the agreement. And somewhat successful. There's a note that in the final text of the Paris Agreement that effort should be made to limit global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees Celsius. So kind of a nice little shout out, if it doesn't have that much actual oomph behind it. So yeah, let's see. I want to talk about the way Sustain Us was structured, and then I'll go into a little bit of the outcome of the Paris Agreement. But I think we did a good job, and we're largely functional as a group of 20 young people between the ages of 18 and 26, coming together, working together for less than a year, and trying to pull off some really big stuff. We organized ourselves into 3 primary groups called teams: the media team, the policy team, and the mobilizations team. And I led our media team. We had co-leaders of the mobilization team and co-leaders of the policy team. And I led our media team with my friend Lee Yona. And I think the media team is the only group that met every day. But so my team met every morning at 7 a.m. We talked about the different events that we held that day or the next day, how we could support them, what people needed help with. We had several delegates become journalists for organizations while at COP. One of our delegates started writing for the New Internationalist, another started writing for Mashable, and we were published in a variety of of outlets, everything from The Nation to Thought Catalog. And it was impressive, really impressive to see just all the content that was coming out of our team. For me, I loved seeing all the videos that were being produced, and all this photography was taken by Sustain Us delegates. So for any action, any event, we were able to send a photographer, send people to wrangle reporters, write press releases, get out the word to reporters ahead of time, and we structured our meetings around that work and trying to elevate the stories of people that we felt like had a valuable message, and also our own actions. And the mobilization team tried to key into other organizations' actions and create their own. And the policy team was engaging a lot with negotiators and trying to push for the best agreement that we could see coming out of Paris with the constraints that it had. Outcome. I am curious to hear from you all what you have heard about the outcome. We have such a diverse group of people in this room who I'm sure get their news from many different sources, and I'm curious to hear what folks have heard about the outcome. Thank you.
I'll start by saying I've heard it was a good beginning, but a whole lot more is needed.
Yeah.
The targets are still voluntary.
Yeah. Can you say that a little
The
louder?
targets are still voluntary.
Go for it.
Yeah, I heard it was a really fabulous and revolutionary outcome coming out of Paris, that all of these sort of corporate-controlled nation-states around the world can voluntarily not make huge profits and plunge us into darkness together. And but unfortunately, the only actual policy with teeth was that the United States cannot be sued for reparations under any circumstance for its willful contribution to runaway climate chaos. But since everybody else is so philanthropic, I'm sure it's going to work out. Happy New Year.
Yeah, I heard wonderful news too. Volkswagen made a total commitment for electric cars.
Yeah, I think the message that's come out I think the message that has really been pushed by the international community has been that it's a good start, and there are some pieces in it that are important. We were able to ensure that we'll come back to the agreement later and that we'll be updating it, which is a really big deal. And there are some components for transfer of technology and finance to the least developed countries. But I think largely it's not going to give us the solutions that we need. It's not going to provide us with the tools that we need to carry this out. And so it's up to us to figure out how we're going to do that at a local level, because it really does leave the majority of the work, almost all of it, 99.9% up to local communities to make that happen. And so it's up to us to transition our...
Can you summarize what was agreed to? Because I think a lot of us didn't necessarily hear what the details are, just that there was an agreement.
So there is an agreement to try to, as came out of Copenhagen, to try to maintain global temperature rise at 2 degrees Celsius. Unfortunately, the nationally determined contributions that I mentioned earlier, they add up. I have a friend who works for Climate Interactive, which is an organization that uses extensive modeling out of MIT and Stanford to try to look at, okay, if we have certain contributions, what does that add up to in terms of global temperature rise? They're saying at least 3.4 degrees Celsius temperature rise based on the voluntary contributions that have been brought to the table so far. So we have a certain amount of money that's been allocated through the Green Climate Fund to provide technology for the developing world to transition into renewable energy. Again, not nearly enough. Out of Lima, they had set to try to raise a certain amount, and I think they raised about 1/10 of it. So, like, not nearly enough money even for that to happen in developing nations, for them to transition.
Just $100 billion, right?
Yeah, it was $100 billion, and I think they raised about 10.
Yeah, the old
10
one
million.
failed, and now they promised again. 100 billion, which is not much.
And again, it's voluntary. It's asking countries to voluntarily donate to that fund. Yeah.
So if the 1.5 degree or 2 degree rise were to be reached, what would happen? What were the countries committing to do in order to stop that rise? How would that just be stopped? I don't know.
I think that, so global temperature rise maximum, they're saying we need to do stuff now to prevent that.
Okay.
But they had not committed to do enough to prevent that.
Right.
Yeah.
Is there a specific blueprint that has been developed? I mean, there probably are technical models that show, you know,
It's
how much of the electrical generation has to come from renewables by so many years. Transportation and space heat are the
as I
other
mentioned in the
sectors.
beginning, it's all nationally determined. So each country has its own plan to bring forth their nationally determined contribution. They have, and in the United States, that looks like the Clean Power Plan, which is primarily shifting power plants from coal to natural gas, which unfortunately we know natural gas has a greater greenhouse gas emissions than coal, actually, when you take into account the methane that's emitted during extraction. Its greenhouse gas impact is actually greater than coal. So the Clean Power Plan is taking into account only the emissions from burning the natural gas, but not the up to 11% methane that's released when it's fracked. So the Clean Power Plan has some really important pieces in it, but the major component of it is shifting these power plants to natural gas, and then also, you know, adding scrubbers is another big component of it to try to reduce like the hard metals that are being emitted and impacting communities and on health and stuff like that. But it's where is it happening? I think that among like the most impacted communities, that is absolutely a key component of what they're asking for and calling for is just, you know, reduce your actual use. But yeah.
Yeah, to get back to Kurt's question about specific policy modeling, a lot of organizations have been doing that, both for the U.S. and internationally, but my take is that as long as the whole system is based, as Henry so well put, on countries basically offering whatever policies they choose to offer, with very little in the way of, or really nothing in the way of specific mandates or requirements about what those proposals need to look like, it's really anybody's guess. And that's why these various modeling groups have been trying to project what's the result of what's been put on the table, because there's no means to really get any more other than this notion that somehow the diplomats are going to feel some sense of moral obligation to do something. The other thing that I want to mention that's gotten very little coverage is if you look at the language on oversight, the agreement creates this body that's supposed to oversee the process, but it says explicitly that it's supposed to be, I forget the exact language, but basically non-adversarial and non-punitive. So there are all these consulting bodies that are being created, but none of them have any teeth at all.
And just to go back to your point, Brian, I mean, as I mentioned at the very beginning of the talk, we had a real shift out of the Kyoto Protocol because the United States did not ratify that, and so it moved forward, but without the United States coming in, it really was pretty ineffective. And then they had this shift to the nationally determined contributions. So we're just in a double bind where neither of these give us the solutions that we need, because neither of these approaches give us the solutions that we need, as the United States doesn't sign on at all, or the United States gives us, all the countries give us something subpar. So it's a real double bind situation, and which is why I think I wanted to go, largely not because I thought that the process was going to give us something that would provide us a blueprint for how to move forward on climate action, but really because it was an opportunity to meet the people who are going to make that change and lead that transition.
So in this process, going to Paris and being with young people, so what's the next plan? Are we coming back to the local level, forget the international level? Is this an election year? Where do we go?
Yeah, I am really excited to do the next activity with Kathy because it is bringing it back to the local level. I see that as the real next step, is trying to work within, I mean, it's part of the reason I'm working with Rights and Democracy, and why I worked with 350 Vermont, and am excited about the local initiatives to shut down fossil fuel infrastructure projects. Like, that is huge. No new fossil fuel infrastructure. Like, that has to be a political mandate, that we stop approving this stuff, because it is tying us into fossil fuel infrastructure for the next 50, 75 years, and we can't afford that. So that's one piece, is shutting down the bad. Building the good is another piece. You know, how are we building out renewable energy? Is it for communities, by communities? Are we building our democracy and supporting our democracy by creating the energy solutions that we need? And I think it's really about people and relationships and connections, because that's what's going to carry us through both of those pieces. So, sorry. Oh,
I'm just curious for a little bit of a report from you about how pushy you were at the forum that Shumlin was at.
That event.
There's the beach.
Yeah, it goes into shutting down the bad, because right now in Vermont we have the biggest fossil fuel infrastructure project in 50 years that's being proposed, and our governor is supporting it while calling himself a green leader and going to the Paris climate talks to sit on a panel of local climate leaders. And what the heck? Like, it just doesn't add up. And it was amazing to be in Paris, and I'm so glad I went, because, and this is a good example of it, everything moves so fast in Paris, like, or at the COPs, because it's 2 weeks of, I probably slept four hours a night I was getting up at 6:30 a.m. to lead a meeting at 7 a.m. every day, and I was staying up until 3 to plan for the next day. And everything moves so fast because everyone's working around the clock, but it means that you can pull off big stuff. And let's see, I heard that he was going to be giving this speech on this panel less than a week in advance, and got in touch with the Global Grassroots Justice Alliance folks who were sent from the Vermont Workers Center, Sheila and Sonoa, who are from Vermont. Knew they were in town, and got in touch with Anna Rose and Lindsay Gillies and you, and A bunch of other people have been working on the pipeline fight and said, let's do something big on this. And they helped put me in touch with a lot of people who are either from Vermont or had some Vermont connection who were in Paris. And then also, we targeted every single one of the people on that panel. It wasn't just me, it wasn't just Shumlin.
Okay.
Every single person on that panel either supported fracking, or one of them had a bunch of oil projects in Washington. But we had people from Denton, Texas. So we called a meeting because we were like, this is ridiculous. All these local climate leaders who are being brought together are actually in states where either they're working for an administration that supports this stuff or they personally are pushing for it. And so we had panelists from Vermont, Shumlin, Washington State, California, where Governor Brown is pushing fracking big time despite the huge drought and wildfires and all this stuff, water crisis, and they're using millions of gallons of water for fracking. And we got people from all of these states to come together and interrupt their own politicians. And then we had folks who were from impacted communities, the Marcellus Shale region of Pennsylvania and Denton, Texas, and people who had been in the tar sands blockade. And within like 2 days, we were able to pull together like 25 people who were willing to help plan this, basically the shutdown of this panel. Made beautiful art. I don't think my photo of the banner is there, but maybe you saw it on the front page of the Free Press. And they, created this beautiful art for us, and I didn't actually know until the day before that I was going to do that. I thought other people were going to be interrupting, and I just was like, yeah, I felt pretty strongly about it, and also relatively confident. And some of the other people who were interested in doing that had some really negative interactions with police in Vermont, and had been injured and did not want to be in a situation where that could happen again. And so they took kind of roles where they were much less likely to have that happen again. Decided to do that the day, to take a speaking role the day before, and I just felt really strongly about it. I feel really strongly that he's wrong on this one, and wanted to use the fact that I was in Paris to help elevate the story in Vermont about the project. So, it was good. And the funny thing, I had lunch with Governor Shumlin the day before. COP is really funny because you see everyone, like, unless it's Hillary Clinton or somebody who gets her own cafeteria, like, everybody else is just around. And so I just saw Governor Shumlin in the cafeteria and went up to him and was like, hi, I worked for you in 2008 as Paige, and nice to see you again. And he's like, oh yeah, Aly, like, good to see you too. And came and sat down with, I thought that was going to be the end of it, but then he came back and sat down with me and two of my friends and ate lunch with us for 45 minutes and chatted about how he knew my mom and my dad. And about how his daughter also went to Smith for a while, and meanwhile I'm just but
thank you.
More than happy.
What's happened with him since then?
I think he's gone into hiding a little bit.
He got married, didn't he?
Yeah, he got married.
He did get married.
Yeah, he got married.
But for you, Aly, what kind of feedback did you get? Clearly he was not all that enamored of your behavior, but like in terms of Vermont Vermont knowing about it and your
Yeah.
husband, like what kind of response have you gotten?
I was totally overwhelmed. It was by the support from people in Vermont. I got so many messages on so many platforms. Like any way people could contact me. I was getting messages on LinkedIn. And, people just were so kind and so supportive, and I expected to get a little bit more pushback on it than I did, and I had one guy who's maybe worked at Whole Foods, owner of Whole Foods or something, he was like, you should be ashamed of yourself. But that was one out of probably 75 people who reached out to me personally to say thanks. And so I was just really overwhelmed. And the Montpelier, the Times-Argus, I wrote an op-ed within a couple days about it, and the Times-Argus published it, and then also added their own commentary from their ed board. That was like, Governor Shumlin should have held his tongue.
That was pretty cool.
So yeah, but I think one of the pieces that may have gotten lost in that was that it wasn't just me. It was also Sheila and Sanoa, and a whole coalition of people who interrupted all of the panelists on that, and really shut down the whole thing, because everyone on that panel represented states where they were pushing fracking or some sort of fossil fuel infrastructure. And so there were at least 25 of us who were involved in it. But it was just cool to see the energy around shutting down fracking, because it's such an interesting issue, because it's being pushed as a clean energy solution and it's just not. So it's cool to see that people are really awake to that.
When you said that you wanted to use the international stage to sort of elevate the platform in Vermont, and that's one of the things that I think it really did, was it brought it right back up as a huge issue in Vermont. And since that time, Rebecca Foster has collected signatures from 160 community leaders and representatives and business people, and also, is that coming up? Am I sure? And also now is asking additional individuals, that got submitted to to Governor Shumlin and to the Public Service Board as part of the public comment. And I don't know if it's still open online, maybe somebody else knows it. But everybody here has probably already signed it, right? Okay.
You should sign it tomorrow, because I think they're presenting it on Tuesday.
So if you haven't signed it, to get on and do that.
I'm glad if it helps even a little bit. Cool. If there aren't any other questions, then we'll hand it over to Kathy.
Can I just make a quick comment? Also in the news recently, Brian and Aly and Anna and I were blocking eminent domain proceedings, and it was one of the richest and most successful actions I've been part of in Vermont, or maybe at all, singing and completely effectively shutting down the eminent domain hearing and shutting down their site visit. And the company, the Vermont Gas Systems, has said that they can't get their act in gear by the 8th, that they might pull out. So y'all are all hopefully going to get invitations to come and participate in these singing blockades and get to spend some time together kicking their butts.
It's pretty awesome. They have to do these site visits to assess property that they're going to seize. And we stood on private property with a banner so they couldn't drive in. And so the police couldn't remove us because it was private property, and they couldn't get in. And so the site visit didn't happen, and then they postponed another landowner's site visit for a week. So we'll see what happens, because that seems to indicate that maybe they weren't so serious about pulling out by the 8th if they're postponing site visits. So we'll see what happens, but interesting time in the pipeline campaign. Thanks for coming. All right. Okay, cool.
All right, thanks, Aly. Chair 359,
Vermont, and I'm on the advisory board of Rights and Democracy, and I have been involved in a process of helping develop Rights and Democracy's philosophical framework and the beginnings of putting together a legislative agenda. And the idea behind all of this is that we're not looking at old school environmentalism anymore. We're not looking at just focusing on the natural world and saying these are things that need to be preserved or protected. We're looking at I think it's starting to be a much more whole systems approach, and we saw, it's talking about systems, and it's talking about impacted communities and frontline communities, and it's talking about indigenous rights, and it's talking about the rights of nature. And the idea that we also then have to take our collective body of human beings into a new way of doing things, into what's fundamentally a post-carbon world, the post-carbon economy, and a completely different value structure. And, particularly in opposition to what we're seeing in, Western-style industrialization. And that's a colossal transition. And that involves an enormous amount of coalition building. It involves an enormous amount of systems thinking and of figuring out ways of communicating both the details of what we're doing, the larger philosophical constructs, but then also figuring out what does all of this look like on the ground? How do we actually promote legislation that and citizen-based activism that gets us to that point? And, I think we've all been through visioning exercises of what's this world that we're all trying to create and what does it look like? And it's going, what's the beautiful picture of, when we throw our hats over the fence, what are we trying to get to? But there's a lot of steps between here and there, and how do we consciously and strategically craft those steps? And James is going to talk about some of the details around all of this some more, but I think a fundamental part of the work of Rights and Democracy as a whole is this sense of crafting that future, finding people with bold, aggressive philosophical framework that are willing to run for public office, and then helping them develop the tools that they need that have teeth in them, unlike a lot of the international agreements that we've seen, that actually help us move all of this work forward. And what's exciting is that we've already seen jobs, justice, climate, and action, going back last year to the People's Climate March in New York, and that was a coalition of a broad spectrum of individuals and organizations, led by, indigenous people and frontline people, and led by trade unions, and led by people who are, hands and boots on the ground all the time, doing the work and being impacted by all this. And that to me was a really inspiring example of what's possible when we bring all of this together, when we infuse it and surround it by beautiful art and great vision and a really vast spectrum of folks. And so what Rights and Democracy is in the middle of doing right now is trying to figure out exactly what do we need to focus on and what do we need to do. And so this is one of a series of what are going to be many gatherings around the state and in New Hampshire, because clearly being able to cross borders and work regionally is another important part of the puzzle. Around figuring out what do people think, this is crowdsourcing the work, what do people think is the most important stuff to be working on, and then what do we craft in terms of, what are the leverage points, what's the strategy around solid legislation that will actually help move the needle. So what I'm going to share with you right now is the preamble, because it was sort of in a Jeffersonian sort of mode, that articulates the philosophical framework. And then James is going to come in and talk about, you can see he's putting buckets of ideas and foci around the room. And what we'll be he'll talk about it a little bit, but then what we'll be asking you to do is grab a pen and go around and look at all of these different leverage points and let us know, within that larger context of, say, transportation or energy conservation and efficiency, what could we be potentially doing that would be the most effective? And are we missing anything else? Are there other buckets we should be looking at? What do we need to craft? And coming up with very specific ideas about how to move all this stuff forward. And we don't have to come up with all the answers today because we don't have as much time as we would normally have in a more charrette-style gathering. But it's an opportunity on the heels of the international work that Aly was talking about how do we bring this down to, where the rubber meets the road, as it were, in Vermont, and what are we going to accomplish? So I want to, as a source of inspiration, I'll read you the preamble to all of this work, and then James will come up and give you a more detailed framework for how we're thinking about all this stuff. We, the people of Vermont, imbued with a sense of moral responsibility, deep urgency, fierce determination, and unswerving hope, commit ourselves to addressing the immense challenges of climate change, social and economic inequity, and political stagnation by building a political and social movement to support and defend communities already struggling with the effects of climate change, promote systemic racial, social, and economic justice and equality, decarbonize our economy while ensuring livable wages and dignified working conditions, build new energy, transportation, and agricultural systems that can halt, reverse, and restore degraded environments, ecosystems, and communities, create a true democracy which represents and upholds the will of the people rather than the will of corporate interests, learn from, collaborate with, and support allies around our region. We pledge to support this work by operating with the ethical principles of universality so that everyone without exception benefits from our work, transparency so that decision-making is clear and accessible, equity so there are no discrepancies in availability or outcome, accountability so that leaders must answer for their decisions and there are mechanisms of accountability for the enforcement of rights, participation so that everyone has skin in the game, it's a technical term, and sustainability so that our work generates enduring systems which benefit countless generations to come. So that's the basic idea. And then James, I will have you come on in and talk some gritty details.
All right, thanks Kathy. This is essentially the second time Kathy and other folks that we've been working with Rights and Democracy have had kind of gatherings to talk about, this kind of vision for it. And there's obviously mountains of great work that's been done, many by people in this room and other organizations. Partly with our organization, we're trying to gear up and actually, build enough leverage to hold policymakers, lawmakers accountable and actually get people from movements to take some of those positions, because some of the lessons that we've had, of actually trying to, we can sometimes stop bad things, and there's some great examples of that, but actually for me, doing the work around trying to implement a universal healthcare system that's actually in the best interest of our communities as opposed to, a huge industry that people are making a lot of money off our health. How do we actually have a government that can actually do that? And so we want to have that vision, both short-term and long-term, for what concrete stuff that could happen that actually, is steps towards the kind of world that we want to be able to give to the next generation and the generation after that. So partly the idea for this, and we want to, we've been working a lot with 350 Vermont. We want to be working with a lot of specific organizations that are doing work on this, and a lot of organizations that aren't, faith community groups, labor unions, any kind of community groups, but also neighborhood groups, people having house parties, to have these kind of conversations about what the agenda that we want to look at is, and then be able to actually start building that agenda and then holding people accountable to it. Specifically, in this next election, this question that was asked, what's next in Vermont? We're going to have people running for governor who say they care very deeply about climate change, just like Peter Shumlin did, and saying a lot of the stuff that they think people want to hear. And obviously in Vermont, certainly for the next generation of voters, it's going to be a huge issue. So we're going to get a lot of lip service around that stuff. So how do we actually have concrete stuff that we say, yeah, you say you care about this stuff? For instance, will you commit to not building any more fossil fuel infrastructure? And so that's these kind of buckets that we've started laying out, and we want to have these conversations and involve as many people in the process and organizations. So, because Aly was here and was able to give this report back, we wanted to be able to, basically give a little sneak preview of this, but we don't have obviously a tremendous amount of time to do this. We want to have opportunities to do this kind of discussion more deeper with partnering organizations, so anyone here that's interested. But I'll just go through the specific details of these buckets, and I would love to get feedback. There's a potluck after this, and so we can go around and write up some of the stuff tonight. But it just also give you a sense of if we were going to host this with with your organization and here or anywhere else, what it could look like. So the first one is transition from fossil fuels to renewable energy, which would include things like no new fossil fuel infrastructure, 100% clean energy by 2050, binding commitment to achieve this goal, carbon tax and just transition fund was one of the ideas that was generated. So those are some examples of that. Another is just transition of jobs and a new economy. What would just transition to clean energy jobs look like? Would there be job standards to make sure that they're good jobs, livable wage jobs with dignified working conditions? Retraining incentives for workers displaced because of transitioning out of the dirty fossil fuel economy, engaging with labor unions. Another bucket is energy democracy, guaranteed grid priority for locally generated renewable energy, policies and funding for community and cooperatively owned energy projects, commitment to access and opportunity for ownership of renewable energy for all, raising the capacity for communities to participate and deliberate on energy futures. Another bucket is energy conservation and efficiency. So net zero building codes, credits for renewable retrofits for owners, job program for retrofits was some of the examples we had. Another bucket is transportation. Immediate steps to bring down transportation emissions in a rural setting. An idea was moved to a 4-day work week. Incentives for working remotely in home office, carpool credits. A public education for a new economy was a bucket that folks came up with. Thinking that if we're going to be transitioning to this, that we actually have to get our heads around it. This is a big thing, and we have to do it. So it has to be a focus. So what skills and knowledge do we want post-carbon citizens, resident staff? How can we have our kids understand their futures? Education for a new world, a new future, education for democracy, the kind of democracy that would be required for this. Capacity building for social capital with younger generations. Another bucket is rights of nature, coming out of a lot of global movements about we have a very kind of human-centric idea of our economy and who it serves and should serve, and we're quickly learning that philosophy is a dead end if we don't think about the rights of all living things. And then another bucket would be human rights and climate change. The right to a healthy environment, clean water systems, and the rights of disaffected and marginalized communities, impacted people, indigenous communities, immigration rights, open door to climate refugees, rights of future generations. So those were the kind of gigantic buckets that were developed, and what we would like to do is try to figure out through lots of conversations and brainstorming, and people kind of getting involved and working in collaboration. How do we look at all of that stuff and start building towards an agenda of, that would be an agenda for a new economy, but ultimately an agenda to address climate change in a real way, so we don't just have lip service. The other kind of context of this, I think that for rights and democracy, and especially now that we're working with folks in New Hampshire, is Vermont right now is like lifted up as the green standard. This is why Shumlin was out there. And the reality, I think for a lot of folks in the room, are if we actually just exported what Vermont does to all 50 states, we're still going down a dead-end path. So if we have a real responsibility, if Vermont's going to be lifted up as this, model, to actually be a real model. So that's partly our thinking of it. But folks in New Hampshire are actually really excited to work, with folks here. So we want to engage with a lot of the same kind of conversations over there. And these are some of the big issues that they're dealing with in the election. And it's obviously much different political climate, but they're fighting pipelines. They're, much similar situations as well. So how does that sound?
Mouthful.
Yeah. It's a lot, but yeah. How are we doing on time?
Yeah, about half hour.
Half hour. So yeah, so the idea is that we could break up and just go around and write up ideas about like what are the big considerations that we should have in these different areas, and then Kathy and I and Aly are certainly around to also talk about as we go into the potluck also what kind of things that we can do in this community and in groups and networks that you're part of. Sound good?
James,
Yeah,
are we looking for specific strategies to move the concept or the goal of those buckets forward?
I think so. Yeah, I don't know if you want to.
Yeah, well, part of it too is this is such the beginning part of this process. So I think the reason why we, just put paper on the back wall and want people to go up and scribble is that it's this is an opportunity for just a sort of free flow of ideas, whatever you've been thinking about around this stuff. When you you're in the late at night, you're in the bathtub or something, it's like, why don't we X, Y, or Z? This is a chance to write it down and put your big harebrained ideas up there, but then also say, those are great, but we're completely missing a particular idea. We're completely missing a particular focus of potential legislation. And so this is a very, sort of skimming off the surface of your brains type stuff. And then if we schedule another meeting like this here in Montpelier, it would be an opportunity for more actual dialogue and note-taking and brainstorming collectively. But because we were sort of piggybacking on Aly's presentation, we thought, just give everybody pens, go up, and get people just scribbling whatever their ideas are, and so that's really what this is about. And but before we release you to do that, certainly if you have any questions about, because Rights and Democracy is such a new organization, because this is because this is huge stuff. If you have any particular questions or ideas that you want to bring forth to the group, or something that you want to have a conversation around.
Good idea. Did everyone get the sign-in sheet? So that's for both 350 Vermont and Rights and Democracy. So we will.
Do you have a website?
We do. It's raddt.org. But yeah.
Sweet.
But yes.
You mentioned that Vermont seems to be the beacon in the country right now on these issues. Have you thought about on the 7th when Donald's here to be able to present Vermont's environmental issues to Donald? Yeah. The Win Theater on the 7th. Yes. Sometimes
there are some counter demonstrations.
Well,
Yeah.
that's, I don't know about counter. I think we should say we love you, Donald. I think we have to use his tactics. We have to use his tactics to take advantage of the media. I mean, where do we go with this? How quick do we go with things?
But it's not giving what he wants if we fight back really strong.
You're giving him what he wants when you fight back. So we have to love him and get him to it.
Let's talk about the Trump stuff over the potluck, because, yeah, I think there's definitely stuff being planned, but it would be great to put some stuff up here for
Totally,
Brad.
and it's a good, we've been very much, involved. We're helping plan what is the rally for love and unity right next door at City Hall Park, trying to not give him the fight that he wants. So people are doing all kinds of
show
stuff.
up at 11 Birdie on the 7th when Trump's in town and have a love.
Yeah. But yeah, no, it's very good.
Stop the violence.
Potluck parties, yes.
Could we put up an extra sheet of paper for additional
Yes.
buckets?
Yes, we will. That's all I'm gonna ask.
I
deliver this free paper. I don't know if anybody's seen it, the Green Energy Times. It's for Vermont and New Hampshire. It's free, and I have a whole lot more in the car if anybody wants one. And, oh, you've got some too?
They were on the chair. They were yours.
Oh, okay, and there's some, we can prevent climate disaster. I was thinking of writing some of this up for that.
Great.
And maybe, I don't know, they're pretty much into getting ads from solar and businesses, but.
Excellent, thank you. Anything else? Other questions before we break up?
Can I just let everybody know that I recorded tonight's event, so if you want to see it again, it'll be on my website, and bobthegreenguy.com/COP21.
Again, slower.
Yep, bobthegreenguy.com/COP21.
Can you tell me again what COP stands for?
It's the Conference of the Parties.
Of priorities?
The parties. The parties are the member states of the UN. So the countries.
It's really confusing.
There's so many acronyms.
UN.
So,
UNFCCC.
So back to your question, if you haven't signed up and you want to make sure that you get information about some of the follow-up stuff, please do so on this line that Brittany has. We'd love to, sit down. If you're really super interested, we'd love to set up the time to grab coffee or something and talk about, this stuff. Obviously, it's new. We had our public launch as an organization just in September, so we're basically trying to gear up for this next election. This is going to be a big issue. It's a big year. We're going to have a new governor, a new lieutenant governor, probably a new Speaker of the House, a new President of the Senate. Maybe, it's going to be a big shakeup, and so it's an opportunity to really try to get them to influence that, but then in a way that we can hold them accountable afterwards.
June.